Hello, I'm Dwyer Murphy. I'm pleased to welcome you to the 2021 Brooklyn Book Festival panel, A Life of Crime, conversation with Naomi Hirahara and Walter Mosley. Before we begin, I want to let you know that books by the authors in this program can be purchased in the link below. Now, to introduce our authors, Naomi Hirahara is an Edgar Award-winning mystery writer and social historian. Her Masarai mystery series features a Los Angeles gardener and Hiroshima survivor who solves crimes. Her first historical mystery, set in 1944 Chicago, Clark and Division, was released in August by Soho Crime. A former editor of the Rafu Shimpo newspaper, she also writes nonfiction books on horticulture, agriculture, and the Japanese American experience. Walter Mosley is the author of more than 60 critically acclaimed books of fiction, nonfiction, memoir, and plays. His work has been translated into 25 languages. His books have been adapted for film and TV. His short fiction and nonfiction essays have been published in a wide range of outlets from the New York Times to The Nation. He's won numerous awards, including an O. Henry, the MWA's Grand Master Award, a Grammy, NAACP Image Award, PEN America's Lifetime Achievement Award, 2020 Robert Kirsch Award, and the National Book Awards Distinguished Contribution to American Letters. Naomi, Walter, thank you for joining us. So I want to begin. I'd like to begin tonight's panel, since this is called The Life of Crime. I think we owe it to our audience. But I want to begin by saying that it seems to me that for both of you, crime fiction wasn't an inevitable avenue for your literature. Obviously, you both have built storied careers in mystery fiction and crime fiction, but there has to have been a point in time when you decided that that was the format you wanted to use. And both of you have gone into, write lots of different kinds of books, not just crime fiction and mystery. So I'm curious, with the stories you wanted to tell at the outset of your careers and anywhere along the way that you questioned it again, but why crime fiction? Why did you turn to that format to tell the stories that were bubbling up inside of you? And Naomi, I was hoping that maybe you'd start us off with an explanation. I'm really curious to hear why crime fiction grabbed you.
I was hoping that you would start off with Walter, mostly because I view him as my senpai, which is a Japanese word that's someone who comes before. He's still going on. But Walter has been him, as well as probably Chester Himes and Barbara Neely, have been seminal in developing me, helping me to turn. Like, I didn't know them at the time. I only knew their works, but I felt they were walking alongside of me. My first book, Summer of the Big Bachi, and bachi means what goes around comes around in Japanese. That took me 15 years to actually, finally write and be able to get published. And it didn't start off, I was trying to do literary fiction, whatever that means. It was told from two points of view. And one of them was this elderly gardener. And I was just, wrestling with the material. And then when I started reading, Rage in Harlem, and just how pungent Hines' characters were, and just the social issues that he was attempting to tackle in his work, I go, wait a minute, this is what I'm doing. And when I was working at the newspaper, I was introduced to Walter's work, and Devil in the Blue Dress. And it was the same thing. It's like, okay, these are people who are doing something that I'm attempting. I've since gotten to talk to Walter more, and he will. Well, I won't tell you what how he answered my questions in the past, but I was attempting to make my father kind of a hero in a story, a working class guy, a gardener. Moss is a fictional character, but he's inspired by all these people. And it just so happens that I call it the container, the mystery is that genre is totally the right container for the stories that I want to tell.
And Walter, how about you? We're curious to hear both of us stuff. Like,
You know, it's interesting. I think that one of the like old time writers who I read a lot of his books was Zola. Like what, 116 books or something. I read a whole bunch of them, and I just love the idea that, well, his Rogan Macquart series is like, he's gonna tell the whole history of France from different points of view, and it just all over the place, different things that are happening, different experiences of the nation. And I said, I thought I wanted to do that with Black people, in after the migration, especially in California. And I wrote the first book, Gone Fishing, which wasn't even in California yet. It was still in Texas, Louisiana. Nobody wanted to publish it. It was like, in the late 80s. They said, well, I mean, they didn't say this, but what they were thinking was, well, white people don't read about Black people. Black women don't like Black men, and Black men don't read. So who's going to read your book? And and I didn't mind. It was the first book. I said, okay, I'll write something else. Most people don't get their first book published. So then I wrote this next book, same characters, Easy and Mouse, but about halfway or maybe 3/4 of the way through the book, I realized, hey, this is kind of like a mystery, Devil in a Blue Dress. Gotten written, and I sold it to Norton. Norton not only bought that book, they said, well, we're going to buy the next book after that because it's going to be a series. And I thought, oh, that's all right. I'll do that, and then I'll do everything else. Now, of course, the other stuff became more difficult because, people say, well, you're a mystery writer. And I go, well, not really. I mean, I'm writing these books. They're mysteries, but I can write other books. And so I've moved around a lot. But I wanted to write those characters, and I just wanted to, following what Naomi's saying, like, listen, Chester Himes is a better writer than Ralph Ellison. There's no question about it in my mind. I mean, what he does, how he writes, how he puts together just sentences, not only just characters, not only like, freeing himself up to, deal with that world. I mean, he's one of the greatest writers of his generation. And I even though I hadn't read Himes when I first started writing mysteries, afterwards I went, oh my God, I'm so glad I didn't read him first. I might never have tried,
I thought we were going to maybe work our way up to Chester Himes somewhere around 20 minutes into the conversation. Steam, wow. But now we're on it, so I want to stay on it for a little bit. So, Chester Himes, the seminal author in the crime fiction world, or sort of, just the world of 20th century letters. And I know that he's had a big impact on both of you. And Naomi, I don't know where I came across this, so please excuse me to whichever interviewer brought out this interesting nugget with you along the way. But I read, and please correct me on the details, but Himes was writing in the home of somebody who had been displaced or interned during World War II. Is that right? And could you explain a little bit of that for us?
Yeah, there's a Nice writer, and she lived in an area. Actually, this is kind of related to my follow-up to Clark and Division, because the next one is going to be taken place in Boyle Heights in 1946. And I'm sure Walter is familiar with that neighborhood as well. So there was, Boyle Heights right next to downtown is, it's an area where new immigrants, poor people, they kind of cycle in and out. And there were a lot of Japanese Americans who were living there at the time of the forced removal. And this one Nisei author was approached, and I will, I know her name's Mary. I'll tell you her full name in a few minutes once this brain starts working. But she was approached to release or rent her home to Chester Himes. And she was a progressive, so she was open to it. So she did it. And I'm actually going to somehow incorporate Himes just like just mentioning him in the next book, because he has personally inspired me so much. And he's written essays in support of Japanese American during that very tumultuous time. So I don't know, this is probably very Japanese of me, but we don't forget in both good ways and bad. And in this way, I haven't forgotten what Himes did. And I wanted to, give him a salute in my next novel.
Well, that brings me to a topic that maybe, Walter, I'll ask you to start, because you mentioned it during your first remarks. You mentioned that you specifically wanted to address the period of the post-migration, so sort of post-World War II Los Angeles diaspora community here. And I wondered why that act of migration, or that sort of giant historical movement in particular, appealed to you, because it seems to me that there's an intersection with Naomi's work as well, which is really focused on some of these massive and traumatic migration periods in history. But Walter, I wondered why that era and that phenomenon in particular had you from the beginning.
Well, I think partially it's something I knew and that most other people didn't know. I mean, they might know, well, yeah, a whole bunch of people came to California after World War II, but they just lumped everybody together and then only told the history of white people. So they talked about Hollywood Boulevard, but they didn't talk about Central Avenue. It's a major place where all of this music, all the major music of America passed through there. It was like such a big place. All these people came and again, like in the South, built the city. And the thing is that the thing I was so aware of is that you don't exist in history if you don't exist in literary culture nowadays. There may be another time where everything was known and whatever, but right now, if I don't write about those people, if I don't write about those times and those places, they actually fade away from history, because people are not reading history books about it. And, and even if they do, they just skip over to the things that are interesting to them. And so I really wanted just to say, well, this is what people did. This is where they came, and not in some kind of, historical thing, trying to follow a particular name or whatever, but just to say, well, look at all these people were here and they came here and this is what they did. And this is how they lived. And this is how they were, cheated out of so many things in their lives, and still working hard, because as bad as it was better than where they were before.
Naomi, I assume, you tell me, but I assume that some of the same motivations were driving you in your most recent novel. So Clark and Division, to give a bit of context, I assume a lot of people here are familiar with it now, but we are looking at the lives of a Japanese American family who is interned during World War II in California and then relocated to Chicago, which is, I think the relocation part of that in particular is maybe a phenomenon a lot of people, or a piece of history a lot of people are not familiar with. And I wondered if some of those same motivations were driving you, and in particular in the context of these different migration patterns, because you are looking at not just the movement of Japanese to America or Japanese Americans from one place to another, but these really fine distinctions within those migration patterns and within those historical eras. So I wonder what motivated you coming into Clark and Division to take on that in particular.
A lot of things. One thing I will have to say, that we write crime novels. And for me, I do look for crime. So when I'm looking for history, I'm not a true crime writer, but the thing is, a lot of one seminal milestone or point in Japanese American history was World War II. Well, those people who were adults at the time, they're no longer with us, or if they're still alive, they have very few memories. So there's so much gaps. There's so much erasure, I think Walter mentioned that too. And that's where I feel like for me as a mystery writer, this is my job. Like, okay, I have, I, this is, I don't know if it's my place, but I feel like, okay, this is where I can work my fiction in imagining what happened to these people. In Chicago, there were 400 Japanese Americans before World War II. There were 20,000, by the mid 40s. And it was an actual document that it came across from this resettlers committee. It was the Japanese American one. And they were bemoaning the delinquency that was happening. There was babies being born out of wedlock. There were abortions, which were illegal at that time, and stigma, a lot of crime that was happening. And I think another reason why I look for those things for my community is that I think Japanese Americans are often painted with like a model minority brush. Like, look at these people, look how they survived. But when I saw that document, and to me, it was like, it humanized us, that if we are going to be relocated, moved so many times, of course, especially if you're a young person, you're an American, you are going to act up. And so I just kind of grabbed hold. These were mostly young people who had relocated first to the Midwest, and they didn't have any, parental supervision. So, they're human. They're going to get in trouble. They're going to look for, parties. They're free. They're no longer confined. And in a very notorious town of Chicago. So, So I think in a way it's kind of reclaiming our history. I think younger generations, they don't really know what happened. I mean, there's a lot that's documented, but there's a lot of gaps because people didn't want to talk about the trauma that was going on because they wanted to maintain a certain image, very scrub, very squeaky clean image. And, the more darker side of life, as a Japanese American, were kind of swept aside. People weren't supposed to talk about it. So I think I feel so much freedom as a crime writer. I'm labeled as a mystery writer, which I like because even within my own community, they could say, oh, there's an expectation. There's going to be crime in this book because it's a mystery book. So I think in some ways, my own community might give me a little grace. Like, okay, well, this is not squeaky, this is not the really shiny image that we've seen in other places, but they'll go along because it is part of the genre.
Naomi, can I stay with you a minute? Because I wanted to ask you a bit about your background working as a journalist, newspaper, and with oral histories too, and how that fed into Clark and Division. Because it sounds to me like you are sensitive to and concerned with the sort of the reception in the community. And I imagine also a lot of the stories that work their way into Clark and Division are informed by things that you learned during some of the, maybe an oral history, for example, or just, interactions within the community. But I'm curious to hear how that has worked, those two different sides of your writing career have played into one another, and in particular with Clark and Division, this new novel.
Yeah, I mean, it's been really invaluable, and I think all those years of like hearing little details, even just a line of what kind of vegetables were grown, in Gardena and Venice, that requires like so many years of knowledge, that go into that one line. So yeah, it's been really helpful. I love being an older person because it takes it takes a long time to get all this information and it planted, and you never know when it's going to surface. So yeah, I'll talk more, but later.
Walter, do you consider yourself a historical novelist in any meaningful sense? I'm just curious because obviously the Easy Rawlins series is set in the past. That's one, I don't know, basic definition of what I guess we could call historical fiction. And yet part of the voice of the E.Z. Rawlins novels seems to me not so much contemporary as alive and like a voice that I recognize as being of the moment and part of our culture today. So I'm just curious how you consider your own that part of your work. I know you have other series, but the E.Z. Rawlins series in particular, I'm curious where you situate it.
The only book I've written that I would consider in any sense historical, well, actually two books, 47, which is about a plantation in Georgia in the 1840s. Now, that's definitely historical. Nobody's alive from them, and all those characters are kind of made up. And so that's kind of historical. And then, of course, my more intellectual novel, John Woman, which is not historical in its own way, but it's about a guy who considers himself an historian and considers the study of history the only deconstructionist art. Okay, just to say that. Now, easy. Well, the way I look at it like this, nothing is really historical as long as there are people around who remember it, who remember the names, who remember the times, who understand it, who understand, the impact that war has had, that racism has had, that sexism has had inside your culture. And so no, I don't consider it historical. It happened a while ago, but everything happens a while ago. Well, not everything. Sometimes you're talking about the future, but most of the time, if you say, "Well, I'm writing about something that happened 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago," when does it become history? It becomes history when there's nobody around who remembers those things.
So, is there any difference in the way you approach like the New York novels versus the E.Z. Rawlins novels, or is it effectively the same, I guess?
Well, different things are happening. Like, for instance, if you're talking about Easy moving around the LA in 1968, let's say, race is going to have a lot to do with everything he does. No matter what he's doing, people are looking at him because he's Black. And even though that's still true in Leonid McGill's period, it's less of an emphasis because, things have changed politically. So he's doing different things. There are different emphases that he's dealing with. Now, yeah, he's still going to deal with being Black. He's still dealing with people for being Black. But, he's a criminal. And he's been a criminal his whole life. And, he deals with criminals. Sometimes a white criminal will say, well, listen, man, I'm going to kick your ass. He said, well, okay, let's see. It's a thing of change. So if I'm going to be writing about 1968 in Wyoming, it's going to be different than 1968 in New York. It's going to be different than 1968 in Mexico City. So yeah, anything that you're writing, there might be some differences, but still the idea of any of them being historical it becomes the question.
Well, you mentioned something, Walter, a moment ago that prompts me to ask a question of Naomi, because you mentioned that this isn't history as long as there are sort of people alive who can testify to it still, who were there and remember it. And I wonder, Naomi, in Clark and Division, if part of the provocation, the reason for writing some of this novel is that feeling that some of these communities who were there and experienced it are soon to disappear, just as a matter of age, that there aren't that many people around who can testify to this still. And was that, I think in particular, I personally had never read a novel, I don't think a history either, that was so specifically about Nisei women and that community and that experience at that time. And I know that you have, privileged access to people within that community, so you have sort of some of their stories, but putting them, memorializing them into this novel seems to me like part of the motivation must be to kind of to memorialize that, to preserve and kind of give a portrait of what that community and life was.
Yeah, I mean, I think I feel the privilege. I wasn't a witness. World War II again is like a big marker, for my personal history as well as my communities. But I wasn't alive then, right? I didn't. So I always call myself a witness to other witnesses,
Mhm.
but now those witnesses are almost all gone.
Mhm.
So I feel like for me in this time of my life, in my generation, like the younger generation, they will come to the story through, oral histories that are online or in books. They will not have met these people themselves. They will not have had the relationships that I had, like working at the newspaper. And, I did, one of the people I dedicated the book to was a Nisei woman, who had lived in Chicago. She was an activist who was, she was the one who fought to have Manzanar as a National Historic Site. So I don't know. So I just feel like I have this advantage, of actually knowing, of seeing their bad sides, of hearing them speak a little more honestly, sometimes not total, transparency, but and have a sense of humor, all those things that oftentimes I think when people characterize like Asian Americans or Japanese Americans, especially men, they're like completely stoic, no sense of humor. And that's not my experience. So definitely, I wanted to, in a show like a more multidimensional, yeah, it's kind of based on people I actually know. It's fiction, but it's based. Oh, I wanted to tell you the name of the woman. Her name's Mary Oyama Mitwer. That Mittwer. That was the woman in Boyle Heights, and Chester Himes lived in her and her husband's house. But anyway, so that's history, right? So, um, but what we're doing is kind of jumping off of that, and yeah, if I were to tell you that as a historian, only certain people would be interested in that. But if I could somehow braid it
Mhm.
into a crime novel, it's like, oh, a lot more people will get that information.
It's so true. People reading mysteries. You can put anything in a mystery. Like, for instance, if you want to talk about, Mexican farm workers in California, and you write a kind of a novel or a history book about these people and they're working on farm workers, and you're talking about the trials and tribulations, which are really important. Only certain people are going to read it. If you write about like the guy who runs one of these plantations gets killed and somebody thinks it's one of the workers, and they hire a Mexican detective from Los Angeles to come up and check it out, then people are going to be reading like, oh my God, well, oh, they have detectives. This is going to be great, because the story is who killed this white plantation owner, and it becomes a kind of a wonderful thing. I wanted to add also, because talking about history and knowledge, it's interesting because knowing about people, there are many times I'll be in Los Angeles or in New York, and I'll be going somewhere in a taxi or in a limo of some sort, and I'll be picked up by some, a black person who's talking, and from their talking, I can tell that they're not from here. I said, "So where are you from?" And they'll say, very often, "Africa." And I say, "Well, Africa's a pretty big place. Where exactly, are you from? From Ethiopia? You from Zaire? Or where are you from?" And they'll go, "You know about the countries of Africa?" That's right now today. People have no knowledge of like so many things. Listen, we're all guilty of it. But the notion is, somebody will say, "Oh, look at those Chinese people." I say, "They're Chinese?" So, well, yeah, I don't know, Japanese, Korean, something,
Close
Chinese,
enough.
huh?
Close enough.
Yeah, exactly. Because they say, "Oh, they're from Africa." I said, "Well, man, but is it Francophone Africa? And and so the notion is what I is more likely. I'm just funneling potential knowledge at people and in the work and telling the story about somebody like Naomi was saying, that becomes interesting because it's kind of wrapped up in a genre that that people find very interesting. People use mystery to try to understand what's wrong with the world that they're living in.
It seems to me that both of you are also using crime fiction to explore identity in a way that, besides sort of socio-historical events, identity is explored usually by your detectives or whoever is acting in the detective capacity. And maybe that's something that makes your crime fiction stand out, or maybe it's something that you're a movement that the two of you are helping lead. But it's one of the more exciting things I think that happens in crime fiction now is the expectation is not for Marlowe to sort of walk down the mean streets and then come out the other side the same person with very little new knowledge of himself, but maybe some new feelings towards Terry Lennox, but rather like the detective in your novels really is exploring some important existential piece of themselves and learning something. Maybe this is just an observation, but I wonder if both of you are looking to use crime fiction in particular in that way, as not just you're both describing kind of smuggling in history lessons with your crime fiction, but I think you're also using the detective, the private eye, the sleuth as an investigation into the nature of identity and what it means to sort of be an American or a Japanese American or a Black American in that era and that time. But these are real individuals exploring their identity. So I'm curious about it, in particular, Naomi, for Clark and Division. One thing that I had never sort of come across or thought about much is these sort of distinctions in patriotism within the Japanese American community, who performed it, who felt it sincerely, who resented it. And that was it's an interesting phenomenon of identity in that period. But is that something that you found in the community that was a real distinguishing point or divisive point even?
Oh yeah, very, very much so. I mean, I think there's a classic novel, John Okada's No No Boy, in which the protagonist refused to fight and was thrown into prison. There was a draft resistors like within the Japanese American community. And then on the other side, you have the 142nd. Many people are familiar with that combat team. Many of them came from Hawaii, but a lot of them came out of camps to fight for the US Army. And after World War II, they were like Truman lauded them. And I think they probably did change some of the American public's kind of view of what a Japanese American, like maybe we should trust these people. But then on the other side, these draft resistors, they had a point, like why we will fight for you if you get rid of the camps, because they were looking at our Constitution. Yeah. So that bitterly, and that lasted, like I was a newspaper reporter and editor like in the 80s and 90s. And that point, what position these men took and women too, totally divided the community, even to that point where people were, I was fielding all these, letters to the editor and how these different groups should be portrayed in museums was being debated. But it gets to the heart of what we, okay, if you're willing to die and sacrifice your life, you can be an American. But why does our group of people have to pass that test, So it brings up a lot of issues and just generally about identity, because my editor and I were debating how to start the book. It's kind of a slow burn. I kind of take people from Aki, my protagonist's birth in this place called Tropical which is in Los Angeles. And I'm glad I did it. It was purposely, I wanted the reader, you are witnessing, because a lot of time where a person is born is debated, as we all know. But it's like, you're witnessing, she is born in Los Angeles. This is an American woman, because during World War II, there were these terms, non-alien, alien and non-alien were used. What the hell is a non-alien? So I wanted to kind of plant from the very beginning, kind of this seed, this is the person you're following. So
I thought the opening to Clark and Division is really beautiful, and I had to put it down a couple of times because I was really moved, and I needed to let it settle on me. But those are some incredible passages. Walter, I wanted to ask you: is that
before you do that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Like, so how was the start of your question to Naomi? It was about.
I was talking about
identity
and detective.
Right. I just like, listen, I like to take as many compliments as I can about things that I do and don't do. And I think that both of us are doing what you're saying. However, it's from the 30s. Great, missing using the term, but great noir fiction has been existential. I mean, Hammett, was a communist. It's like, and there are people who really are questioning, if not the identity of the detective, which I think is something that is a change that maybe we've done, but it's also if it's not that, it's the questions, the psychological depth, the political, the social depth of the characters. I mean, Ross MacDonald is a great example of that. And so, I mean, we're continuing a movement, not necessarily creating. I think that when it starts to have, racial identity or even, to some degree, gender identity, that's new stuff. But the genre's always been trying to do that stuff,
And there's always been the outsider, right?
Yeah.
The outsider.
Yeah.
And it's just been the outsider and the insider are just being defined a little differently.
Yeah. Well, we're using it to make, political statements that, beforehand, weren't being made, or were being made saying, well, you see those people over there, they're just as good as these people over here, but instead what we're doing is we are those people over there. So, so that becomes a difference.
Yeah, that's exactly, I think, what maybe distinguishes some of so you mentioned like the Lou Archer novels, the Ross MacDonald, which I don't think anybody could dispute. Those are as existentially profound, in my opinion, as anything that was written sort of in the last 60, 70 years. But I can't imagine Lou Archer having a moment to dwell on. For example, like in Blood Grove, Easy is approached by a veteran who has this particular issue that only Easy can solve. And it immediately prompts Easy to sort of dwell on the nature of his own patriotism and his community and his identity. There's sort of a really provocative, interesting passage where he breaks down in Blood Grove what his different identities could be, and every other person around him, what their identities are and what it means to be an American. And, not that I think in a Lou Archer novel, maybe one of the secondary characters would have had that moment sort of in a bar in Reno where they kind of meditate and brood on that. But in your book, for example, it's actually, Easy himself is immediately prompted by his case to consider that about himself and not.
Oh yeah, no, I believe that we open up new things, and which I think is great. But I also think when Ross MacDonald, every novel is almost exactly the same. They're just so beautifully written; they're worth reading. When he says, "Well, any crime committed now has a history in your psychological past." Well, I mean, that's really a wonderful, way to, just think about human beings. And, and I want to use that in my books too, but I agree that there's a political note. We've kind of politicized that existentialism to a degree, you know. So, but you know, it's nice to be part of a movement, you know, like, you know, and you know, you come out of somewhere and you say, wow, now I can talk about all these other people that have, you know, they never talk about. I mean, Chandler never talks about. One time he might talk a little bit about, you know, like South Central, and that's it, you know.
Do you both identify as California crime writers? Speaking of traditions, I know, Naomi, your books are geographically in different spots and in particular, but you know, you're both have this West Coast connection and you're working out of some of the diasporas of the West Coast. Do you identify as being part of a West Coast or California tradition? Is that something that's distinct from East Coast fiction in your minds? Do you feel that at all?
I don't feel that as much. I think there is some kind of diaspora going on. I haven't really put my finger on it. I don't know if I could totally describe it at this time, but yeah.
You're here at the Brooklyn Book Festival, and I'm trying to stir up shit.
Ah,
Walter, do you feel like, is there a California crime fiction tradition that you're a part of? Because you're mentioning here, I mean, you're talking about the Lou Archer novels. That's as California as it gets. You know?
it's true. I'm a California writer. I'm a Black writer. I'm a male writer. I'm a Jewish writer. I'm an American writer. I mean, you know, the thing is to say, you know, and I'm a science fiction writer. I mean, you know, the thing is, it's like, you know, anybody who's like working is probably doing a lot of different kinds of things. I know there's some people in of our ilk. All they do is I write, you know, these mysteries, and I'm, you know, doing it, and that it's going forward, you know, and it's in a certain kind of certain kind of writing and stuff. But you know, I'm writing about, you know, wherever I go, you know, in the thoughts. I might be writing about New York, and I might be writing about, you know, Georgia, and I might be writing about, you know, LA. I certainly start off as an LA writer, you know, because I was writing about, you know, my experiences, you know, in Los Angeles and my imagination in Los Angeles.
I know the typical thing is to say California, you know, California is for reinvention, you know, so that's what, you know, I've been on panels where people really talk about that too, but I don't know. I don't think we have enough time to really navel gaze. I mean, I think we just churn out our books, right?
Yeah,
and we figure out other people can, yeah, you Dwyer, you're a journalist, so you could categorize this.
Okay, will do. Why Chicago, Naomi? That was a city that I hadn't associated with that era of the Japanese American experience. That was really something new for me to see that kind of lush Chicago setting.
Well, it was the government, you know, it was authorities and power, and as well as the Quakers who assisted Japanese Americans. They thought it was a safe place to go. It was the second biggest city in the U.S. It's in the middle of the U.S., you know, away from the military zones, and there's a lot of industry. Now we get back to the defense industry, you know. So kind of ironic, right? You're saying these people are suspicious, but then you're going to send them to work in a defense factory, you know, doesn't, you know, kind of interesting. Yeah. But I think that's why there's been so much interest in Clark and Division. Just the locale is surprising, and there's nothing left. And I think it, you know, has to do again with the whole point of erasure. So I think that could be the power of our books to bring something to light that people are not aware of.
Absolutely.
I feel like that's the theme that we kind of keep coming back to tonight, right? Is that crime fiction is this amazing vehicle to teach people parts of history that they might not be familiar with, or experiences that they might not be familiar with. And you know, your books both certainly accomplish that in an admirable way. I wanted to ask one more kind of craft question. I guess it's a craft question. I don't know. You can be the judge, but I'm curious, Walter, if I could start with you. Who do you imagine when you're writing? Who do you imagine as the reader of what you're writing? And
well, I think it's different ones, you know, for different books, because, you know, I write so many different kinds of books. But I used to say, and I still feel that I had this cousin, Alberta. She quite a bit older than me, and she babysat me when I was a little kid. And I just loved Alberta to death. And what I imagine is I'm in a train and I'm sitting next to Alberta, and Alberta said, "Well, okay, Walter, what's Easy doing?" I said, "Well, Mouse came back." She goes, "Oh no, what does that mean?" And I said, "Well, he killed this guy down in Texas, and the guy's father, he liked him so much he didn't want to have to kill him too, so he came to L.A." So, oh my God, and I hope that Easy's staying away from him. And while I'm telling that story, there's somebody sitting behind who's overhearing the story. So that's the audience, right?
That's the most specific answer I've ever gotten. That is great. It's your cousin on a train and the guy in back of you listening to the conversation.
Well, you don't see them, right? You don't see the readers, but you think if you're interesting enough that, anyway, that's the answer for me.
Naomi, can you give me that version of who's your reader?
Very similar. With Masarai, people would say, that character reminds me of my uncle, my neighbor, my gardener, And then the other response is, I never knew this world even existed. So I think I'm striving to write to both of those readers, and equally so.
All right. Well, that's a really fascinating glimpse into the writing process for both of you, and an appropriate place to end our evening. So I want to thank you, Naomi, and thank you, Walter, and everyone who joined us. Thanks for spending some time with us and for reading crime fiction. We all really get a lot out of it, and it's fun to share this community. So everyone, please remember you can order books in the link below, and please consider making a donation to the Brooklyn Book Festival, which this year is celebrating its 16th year of presenting the free literary programming. So thanks everybody for joining Sunday night with us, and thanks again to our panel for a really—
Thank you. Nice to see you, Naomi.
Yes, so great to see you.